So thank you for being here. I would like to now introduce our first panelist. Our first expert is Professor Donna Hughes from Rhode Island University, who is one of the nation's and the world's leading experts on extremism, extremist violence, and in particular, human trafficking. So we welcome Donna to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, to see lots of friends that sometimes I only get to see once a year or maybe a couple of times a year. We're here to celebrate International Women's Day and to use this occasion to discuss why we need women in leadership to defeat extremism. I believe that women's rights are human rights, and they are central for democracy and peace in the 21st century. Today, we're faced with so much misogyny, which is hatred of women, and extremism. The depths of the atrocities are so horrible, I can hardly believe what I read and hear every day. And to challenge these forms of violence and exploitation, we need women's leadership. Women are the ones who know the cost of the suffering, discrimination, violence, and exploitation. And they are the ones that can teach others and become leaders against these forms of violence. Extremist crimes against women and girls are not limited to any particular group. Women and girls of all ages, nationalities, ethnicities, races, cultures, religions, or economic groups can be and are victims of discrimination, violence, and exploitation. In no country do women and girls have full equality and freedom. One of the essential needs for women to achieve equality is education. The right of girls to go to school and to get an education is under attack. According to Human Rights Watch, in the last 5 years, there have been attacks on schools in 30 countries. Schools have been bombed and burned. Students and teachers have been murdered, raped, and forced into slavery. The rise of Islamic extremism, or Islamic fundamentalism, has brought with it the most extreme attack on education for girls. The Taliban are well known for banning education for girls in Afghanistan in 1996, and in Pakistan and territories under their control in 2009. They banned education for girls. And I was just reminded by looking at the poster over here that in Iran, 70 different majors are banned for women to study. Last December, Taliban gunmen attacked a school in Peshawar, Pakistan, and murdered 141 people, almost all of them schoolgirls and teachers. Almost a year ago, the world was shocked when Boko Haram, an Islamic fundamentalist group, kidnapped hundreds of girls from a boarding school in Nigeria. There are reports that the girls were sold across Africa and to the Middle East and even into Europe. The captive women and girls were used for forced labor to serve their captors as slaves and wives, and some of them were used at their destinations for prostitution. As a result of the attacks and threats against education for girls, many schools have closed, or the parents are not sending their children to school, especially girls. For example, following the abduction of the schoolgirls in Nigeria, more than 15,000 students in the northern region of Nigeria stopped attending school. Women and girls have resisted the attack on their education because no matter how hard the atrocities are, no matter how deep the discrimination is, women and girls always resist. In Afghanistan, women opened secret schools in their houses and offered classes for girls. The most famous spokeswoman for education for girls is Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani girl who was shot in the head by a Taliban gunman for advocating education for girls. She has not been silenced. In fact, now her voice is louder and heard everywhere around the world, and last year she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. With the growth of Islamic fundamentalism and misogynist interpretations of the Quran, there has been an increase in extremist forms of sexual slavery. The extremists claim that their interpretation of the Quran justifies sexual enslavement and exploitation of non-Muslim women and girls. The extremists openly own their violence and claim it is illegitimate according to their fundamentalist ideology. Sexual slavery is another name for sex trafficking, which we know exists in every country around the world. It is not unique to any religion or culture. Several years ago, Iranian activists and I researched the trafficking of women and girls in Iran. And as in other countries, sex trafficking was one of the most profitable criminal activities in Iran. Many of the girls came from impoverished rural areas, and some of the women and girls were trafficked to Arab countries in the Persian Gulf. Others were trafficked to Europe. And if they returned to Iran, they were the ones that were called immoral and blamed for their own trafficking. As the Islamic group known as the Islamic State has gained territory in Iraq, Syria, and groups going by that name in Egypt, non-Sunni Muslim women and girls have been raped, abducted, and trafficked for slavery. Some of the women and girls have been sold as slaves, and these acts are part of a campaign of ethnic cleansing and genocide. The examples of extremist violence and misogyny are growing. Every morning I read the news, and almost every day there is another atrocity. Just the day before yesterday, a woman senator in Australia was threatened to be beheaded if she did not introduce Sharia law in Australia. Rather than shake our heads in horror and say we don't understand these atrocities, we need an analysis, a coherent explanation of these acts. If we want to understand Islamic extremism and the misogyny of its violence and exploitation, I suggest you read Marianne Rajavi's book, Women Against Fundamentalism. She's an Iranian woman who's the head of a pro-democracy opposition group, also called the Iranian Resistance. I first heard Marianne Rajavi speak in 1996 in London. She presented an analysis of the nature of Islamic fundamentalist threat to world peace. Today, what she predicted 2 decades ago is in the morning papers and on the front page. Iran's development of nuclear weapons threatens the region's security. If that seems far removed from our topic today of women in leadership, I suggest you read her book. She explains how misogyny is central to the Islamic extremist political movement. As the world debates how to respond to the extremist threat, Rajavi's experience and insights puts events into a coherent explanation. Rajavi doesn't blame poverty, unemployment, or ignorance for the growing Islamic political movement and its extremist demand for Sharia law or law based on the fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. As an Iranian woman who opposed the Shah in the 70s, then opposed the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Islamic fundamentalism, Rajavi observed and analyzed the religious dictatorship's ideology and oppressive practices and concluded that one of the deepest principles of their belief was the hatred of women. In Iran, this past year, a vicious form of violence has arisen in throwing acid in the face of women. Strong acid burns to the victims cause blindness, disfigurement, and even death. Acid attacks have occurred in many other countries around the world, in South America, Central and North America, the Middle East, and Central Asia. But the most widespread attacks are in the South Asian countries and, as I mentioned last year, in Iran. The perpetrators are frequently men who claim the women have dishonored their families or young men who have been rejected by women. The attackers claim they are punishing women for violating the country's dress code. This is in Iran. The conservative religious leaders in Iran claim that improper veiling has gone beyond limits and can no longer be corrected by just cautioning the women, and that the violations must be dealt with by force. The result was criminal gangs, often on motorcycles, patrolling the streets, looking for women and girls in cars or on the streets who were not veiled properly according to their laws. Marianne Rajavi based her analysis on Iranian or Shia Islamic extremism, but the Sunni Muslim extremists generally hold the same fundamentalist beliefs. They too call for Sharia law, based on their interpretation of the Quran. The sectarian violence that is happening around the world between Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims are power struggles, but at their base is their desire for Sharia law based on their own interpretations of the Quran, which I maybe in this room I don't need to add that, but is certainly, there are other peoples that have much more peaceful, democratic interpretations of the Quran. The extremists are not the only ones that have a right to interpret the Quran or to create law based on it. If misogyny is central to Islamic extremism, Marianne Rajavi takes the logical but revolutionary step of concluding that the liberation from oppression depends on the leadership of women. We must attack extremism at its most hateful, vicious levels, which are the murder of women and girls for the basic right of trying to get an education, the sexual enslavement and kidnapping of women and girls, and the disfigurement of women and girls for refusing to obey oppressive dress code. The people in this room are free. We strongly oppose these forms of extremism, and we support democracy, women's rights, and freedom. I encourage all of you to be the leaders for women's freedom and rights, and to be leaders against the extremism that is growing around the world. It is a threat to democracy and human rights. I recommend that you take the revolutionary step of understanding how misogyny is at the core of this movement and to take up a leadership role to oppose it. Thank you.